What's interesting is that despite Africa having a rich mythological folklore, as well as many different belief systems about the afterlife, almost all the ghost stories per se that are available are post-colonial. So to me, this meant that there is still some kind of Eurocentric thing that's being worked off of the same literary system going back to our European example and M.R. James there. And I was looking for something to be a little different than that. So there's lots of ghost stories that are in South Africa, for instance, but I couldn't find any that were from before Dutch or British colonization. So then I considered, well, maybe I should turn to the Middle East instead. There's a rich ghost story tradition there that goes back to 1001 Nights.
Oh, yeah.
But one real life story kept coming up over and over again in my search, and so I decided to have this be the one that I shared. This is from 2005 in Malawi. It was widely reported that the then president Bingu wa Mutharika had fled his 300-room palace because he believed that it was haunted. Now, two journalists quoted his religious advisor, Reverend Malani Mtonga, as saying that Mutharika had summoned religious leaders there specifically to exorcise evil spirits. A third journalist reported that Mutharika had sensed invisible rodents crawling all over him at night. So, when this came out publicly, Mutharika was not happy about it, and he totally denied it, and he said, I have not seen any ghosts yet. I have never in my life been afraid of ghosts. It's important to note here, too, he is Roman Catholic, or was Roman Catholic, so he had this strange, maybe not strange if you're from Malawi, but he was integrating Roman Catholic religious beliefs with the sort of traditional cultural beliefs from that area.
Oh, yeah. This is a trend we see time and time again.
Yeah. So police officials actually arrested two of these journalists, and they drove them 300 miles to a police station and then charged them with a statute that made it illegal to ridicule the president. This obviously recalled a less democratic past for that nation. It really worried people about what his relationship with the freedom of the press was going to be. The nation's top prosecutor at the time said that the stories that they had written were too irresponsible to ignore, and that he was going to pursue a criminal conviction that would place them in prison for up to 2 years. Now, it sounds like what ended up happening was they were released on bail shortly afterwards. So I think this was kind of like a warning shot for the press in Malawi. Now, it turns out, though, Malawi has a history of ghost stories in its state houses. So, the first head of state, Hastings Kamuzu Banda, said that he was regularly visited by mysterious dwarves at the Sanjika Palace. Yeah, what is up with these ghost dwarves? And his successor, Bakili Maluzi, also suspected that there were spirits there. So the former press officer for one of those administrations said, look, no one could sleep at that presidential residence, so we ended up moving to another one. So I'm reading this and I'm going, what's going on here? This is an article in the New York Times from 2005. Something strange is up. According to the then editor of Malawi's newspaper, which is called The Chronicle, ghosts and spirits are understood to be a part of everyday reality in Malawi, and it was not a taboo subject, and he was surprised that the president reacted this way. Now, when the New York Times reported it, they said in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, traditional superstitions coexist seamlessly with modern sensibilities. Now, I found an example of one. This isn't a ghost per se, but I thought this was worth noting because it's especially upsetting. So I couldn't find anything about ghosts, but it turns out that in Malawi, albinos are a valuable commodity for their body parts. They're often trafficked across borders for use in witchcraft rituals. So basically the idea is that the body parts of albinos are said to bring riches, success, power, or sexual conquest. And the mutilated bodies of albinos are found later on without their hands, their feet, their breasts, their genitals, their skin, sometimes their eyes or their hair. So this is real life horror going on here.
Oh, God,
but it's something that's broadly understood. Now, the ghost thing is interesting. was this simply about saving face because Mutharika didn't like that he looked scared to a global audience? The country's information minister actually claimed that the president was totally unaware of the arrests of these journalists before they happened. He wasn't responsible for them necessarily. Then Mtanga reversed and said, "Oh, no, no, no. All those quotes about me saying that the president was worried about spirits being in his palace, that's not true at all. He doesn't believe in charms." So there's clearly some kind of spin doctoring going on here. So what's up with this haunted building? First of all, like, why have three presidents in Malawi supposedly seen ghosts there? Well, it turns out that it is a $100 million mansion that was erected in Malawi under Banda, that's the first president, while his nation was undergoing appalling poverty. This place has 300 rooms, 2 helipads, a game park, and a banquet room for 600 people. His successor called it obscene opulence, and when the government got a hold of it later on, they said, maybe we should just turn this into a 5-star hotel. Like, it just looks really bad when the leader of the country lives here. When Mutharika was elected, the place was in total disrepair, so he had it renovated. And then he moved in and said, look, it's actually going to cut costs if I live here rather than this other palace in this other city. Now, what I'm wondering here is maybe these ghost stories that are going on, and again, these are real stories. This isn't M.R. James telling a story of a learned gentleman. This is the actual president of a nation who seems to be seeing ghosts in his home. Maybe they're manifestations of the presidential guilt over living in such opulence while the citizenry goes poor. So I did a little bit more digging to learn about Mutharika. He passed away in 2012, and the Guardian's obituary starts off by saying he went from being one of Africa's most respected leaders to a repressive despot in just 2 years. So it seems like, and that was right, so 2005 was toward the beginning of his time in power there. So it seems like this is a guy, he had previously been a loans officer at the World Bank, then he became a dictator afterwards. And when the global recession reached Malawi in 2010, he actually responded violently. He curtailed civil liberties. Protesters of his presidency were shot dead by the police there. And he was criticized for purchasing a $13 million private jet for himself just before this. So he died in 2012 from a heart attack. Couldn't find a ton more about this. I would love it if our listeners who out there know way more about Malawi than we do could chime in. But it seems to me from afar looking at this that there's some kind of, again, post-colonial guilt, right? Like, Mutharika seemed to be this guy who had traveled around the world and had a Western education and came back and was successful and rich and powerful. And yet the people were still poor and were upset at him for these choices he made, living in this huge mansion, buying this private jet, all this stuff, and they reacted to it poorly, but maybe his subconscious was also reacting to it poorly, and also his predecessors. Clearly, they all had this same weird ghost guilt going on.
And of course, one of the things about a ghost story even like this, of course, is that it becomes the property of all those who tell it. It becomes the property of outsiders looking in, as well as the local residents, the people that lived and perhaps suffered under him. So it can be a way to understand or better understand what has happened.
Yeah, now my understanding is you encountered somewhat of a similar thing when you looked at Australia's ghost stories.
Certainly, yeah, when it comes to that, the idea of like two different cultural traditions coming together and creating kind of a hybrid belief system.
Okay.
Which is certainly what I was expecting from Australia, because you obviously have a rich Aboriginal tradition that involves spirit realm and spirits walking among us, and then you have the European traditions that are brought there with the colonial influence and the Western Australians. Okay. So it seems like, I mean, we have a lot of fiction out there, some cinematic, where we see these traditional values of the Aboriginal people kind of melding with European expectations, or it's Europeans telling stories about Aboriginal spiritualism.
Okay, so there's certainly Australian ghost stories. It looks like you've got a book here that you turned to, so there's actual research done on this tradition.
Right. There are two authors in particular, Kim Gelder and Jane